A city is burning on the edge of the ancient sea. Ships lie broken in the harbour. Palace storerooms crackle in the flames, and somewhere in the smoke, a scribe presses one final warning into clay. Around 1200 BC, some of the greatest empires of the Bronze Age began to collapse, and at the centre of the mystery were the feared Sea Peoples. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If ancient history and unsolved mysteries are the kind of stories you enjoy, the coast burns before anyone fully understands that an age is ending. In the darkness beyond the city walls, flames climb over cedar beams and painted plaster, over storerooms packed with oil jars, over courtyards where merchants once counted copper ingots by lamplight. The harbour below is no longer a place of arrival, it is a place of panic. Ships lie broken against the stones, warehouses crackle in the heat. Somewhere in the smoke, a scribe may still be trying to preserve an account. A warning, a final inventory of grain or bronze or men. But clay tablets do not explain fear while it is happening. They only survive it, hardened by the very fires that destroy the world around them. Across the eastern Mediterranean in the centuries around 1200 BC, something begins to go wrong on a scale that even powerful kings cannot control. Palaces fall, trade routes tremble, royal letters grow anxious. Cities that had stood for generations are abandoned, burned, or transformed beyond recognition. The collapse does not arrive like one single army marching under one single banner. It comes as a chain of shocks raids along the coast, famine inland, rebellions in old territories, migrations of people who may themselves be fleeing disaster, and wars that leave kingdoms too exhausted to repair what is broken. At the edge of this storm appear the mysterious groups later remembered as the Sea Peoples, names carved into Egyptian records with the cold certainty of victory propaganda, but surrounded now by questions that have lasted more than 3,000 years. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of the Sea Peoples is not simply the story of invaders from the waves. It is the story of a whole world becoming fragile, then discovering that its fragility had been hidden by its own splendour. For centuries, the great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age had looked almost permanent. Egypt ruled the Nile with divine confidence. The Hittite Empire stretched across Anatolia, commanding armies, vassals, and treaty networks. Mycenaean rulers in Greece built fortified palaces above their valleys and filled storerooms with oil, textiles, weapons, and grain. Cyprus sent copper across the sea. Canaanite ports linked inland caravans to maritime trade. Ugarit, a rich city on the Syrian coast, wrote letters in several languages, dealt with merchants from distant courts, and stood at the crossing point of worlds. It would have been easy for anyone living inside that system to imagine that this was how power would always look: palaces, ships, bronze weapons, scribes, seals, tribute, and kings calling one another brother. Yet the evidence that survives suggests a darker truth. The late Bronze Age world was strong in appearance, but its strength depended on connections that could fail. Bronze itself required movement across distance, because copper and tin rarely came from the same place. Grain shipments had to arrive when harvests failed. Diplomacy had to prevent powerful states from turning every border dispute into catastrophe. Palace economies had to gather, store, redistribute, and defend resources through systems that were impressive but rigid. When the sea was safe, the roads passable, and the harvest tolerable, this network glittered. When too many pressures struck at once, the same network could become a trap. In the ruined layers of ancient cities, the disaster appears unevenly, almost personally. Some sites show violent destruction, with ash and collapsed walls. Some show abandonment, as if people left before the final blow. Some continue in altered form, poorer but alive. This unevenness matters, because no single explanation fully accounts for the end of the Bronze Age palace world. The Sea Peoples are part of the story, but they are not a magic key that opens every locked door. They are more like figures glimpsed through storm rain-armed men on ships, families on carts, mercenaries in foreign service, displaced communities moving along coastlines, perhaps raiders, perhaps refugees, perhaps both at once. The Egyptians, especially under Pharaoh Ramses III, present them as a great northern menace, a confederation of peoples who come by land and sea after destroying other kingdoms. The temple walls at Medinet Habu show ships crowded with warriors, feathered headdresses, round shields, ox carts, women and children, and chaotic battle on the water. It is one of the most dramatic visual records from the ancient world, but it is also royal propaganda, designed to show Egypt victorious and the pharaoh as the saviour of order. Scholars still debate how much of the Egyptian account is literal description, how much is political theatre, and how much compresses many different events into one triumphant image. What makes the mystery more haunting is that the Sea Peoples appear at the moment when other sources begin to fall silent. The Great Archive at Ugarit, for example, preserves letters that seem to tremble on the edge of disaster. One ruler asks for help. Another warns of enemy ships. Military resources are absent. The threat is close. Then the writing stops. The city burns, and the fire bakes its tablets into survival. It is a strange irony of archaeology that catastrophe often becomes the reason memory remains. Without the destruction, the clay may have crumbled. Because the city died, its final anxieties endured. There is no need to imagine the people of this world as distant shadows who calmly watched history happen. The collapse would have entered ordinary lives first as inconvenience, then as dread. A merchant waits for a ship that does not come. A farmer hears that soldiers have taken stored grain. A palace worker notices that rations are smaller. A bronze smith cannot get tin. A mother sees strangers arriving at the edge of town, hungry and armed, or perhaps simply desperate. A soldier is sent to defend a port instead of a border. Rumours move faster than army cities burn to the north, fleets sighted offshore, a king defeated, a road unsafe, a harvest ruined. What survives in the record suggests not one clean fall, but a widening atmosphere of uncertainty. The Eastern Mediterranean had always known raiding, piracy, migration, and war. What changes around this time is the scale and the timing. The old kingdoms are not merely attacked, they are attacked while already strained. Their enemies may not be outsiders in the simple sense. Some may have served as mercenaries in palace armies. Some may have traded in the same ports they later threatened. Some may have been pushed from their homes by hunger, political collapse, or violence elsewhere. The line between invader and survivor can become thin when the world that once gave people identity begins to break apart. That is why the Sea Peoples remain so difficult to define. Their name itself is modern, a convenient label created by scholars to group several peoples mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. The ancient Egyptians did not describe them as a single nation called the Sea Peoples. They listed names: Sherden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Jekka, Denian, Weshesh, and others, depending on the text and period. Some names may connect to later peoples or places, others remain uncertain. The evidence remains incomplete, and every confident theory has to pass through the same narrow doorway: a few inscriptions, scattered archaeological traces, destruction layers, pottery styles, weapons, settlement patterns, and the silence left behind when archives disappear. Still, the image is unforgettable. The sea, which once carried wealth, now carries danger. The same waters that brought copper, oil, wine, ivory, and royal gifts now bring sails that watchers on city walls dread to see. The horizon becomes suspicious. A ship is no longer just a ship. It may be trade, it may be hunger, it may be war. And along those coasts, where palaces had depended on exchange, the old confidence begins to fail. To understand the Sea Peoples, it is necessary to stand first in that burning twilight, before the categories are neat, before the maps are coloured by modern historians, before the collapse has a name. There are only cities under pressure, kings losing control, ships moving through dangerous waters, and people trying to survive a century that refuses to behave as expected. The empires have not yet vanished from memory. Their walls still stand in places, their scribes still write. Their kings still claim divine favour, but beneath the surface, the world is already loosening. The Bronze Age does not end in one night. It ends in many nights like this one, with smoke above a harbour, unanswered letters in a palace archive, and the sound of the sea carrying something no one can quite name. Before the fires, before the desperate letters, before ships on the horizon begin to look like omens, the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most connected worlds humanity has yet built. It is not connected in the modern sense, not by instant messages or printed maps or roads open to everyone, but by something slower, heavier, and more fragile cargoes of bronze, royal marriages, diplomatic gifts, scribes trained in foreign languages, merchants who know the winds, and kings who understand that their power depends on people they may never meet. From the Nile Valley to the mountains of Anatolia, from the palace towns of Greece to the ports of Syria and Canaan, the Late Bronze Age is a world of glittering surfaces and hidden dependencies. At the centre of this world stand the palaces. They're not just royal homes, they're administrative machines. A palace gathers grain from the countryside, stores oil in great jars, controls herds, sends out work crews, tracks textiles, counts weapons, and redistributes food to soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and labourers. In Mycenaean Greece, tablets written in Linear B record this world in dry count, practical detail: sheep, wool, bronze, chariot wheels, women workers, offerings, rations. The records are not poetry, but they reveal something almost more intimate than poetry, the daily bookkeeping of survival. A palace knows how many jars it has, how much bronze is available, how many people must be fed. Its strength lies in counting. Its weakness lies there too. To the east, the Hittite Empire commands an enormous inland realm from its capital at Hattusa, a city of stone gates, temples, archives, and fortifications set among the highlands of Anatolia. Hittite kings deal with rebellious vassals, rival claimants, Egyptian diplomacy, and the constant problem of keeping a large empire supplied. Farther south, Egypt remains the great old power, wealthy from the Nile's predictable rhythm and from centuries of centralized rule. Pharaohs present themselves as guardians of cosmic order, yet even Egypt is deeply involved in the wider system. It sends and receives envoys, it negotiates, it imports timber, metals, luxury goods, and ideas. Its armies campaign beyond the Nile. But its court also depends on the same international language of prestige that binds the age together. That language is visible in royal letters. Kings call one another brother, even when they are not equals and certainly not brothers in any warm personal sense. They exchange gifts of gold, lapis lazuli, horses, chariots, carved furniture, fine textiles, and sometimes daughters in marriage. The diplomatic world is polished, formal, and full of complaint. A king may grumble that the gold sent to him is not as fine as promised, or that messengers have been delayed, or that a marriage alliance has not been honoured with enough generosity. Beneath the ceremonial language lies a sharp awareness that prestige is material. To be powerful is to give lavishly, receive publicly, and maintain relationships across distance. The lesser-known surprise is how international this elite world could be. A ruler in a Levantine city might write in Akkadian, worship local gods, use Egyptian objects, depend on Cypriot copper, answer to a Hittite overlord, and trade with Aegean merchants. A single port could hold pottery from one region, seals from another, weights used by travelling traders, and luxury goods that had passed through several hands before reaching a palace storeroom, Ugarit on the Syrian coast, is one of the clearest examples. It is not the largest kingdom, but it sits like a hinge between inland empires and maritime exchange. Its scribes use multiple writing systems. Its merchants look outward. Its archives preserve the voice of a city that belongs to many worlds at once. This connectedness is the glory of the Late Bronze Age, but it is also the danger. The system depends on specialization. Certain regions produce what others need. Cyprus is especially important because of copper, the metal that gives bronze its foundation. Tin, rarer and harder to trace, travels through long-distance networks that may stretch far beyond the Mediterranean. Without copper and tin, bronze weapons and tools become harder to make. Without ships, copper cannot move easily. Without safe ports, merchants cannot unload. Without grain reserves, cities cannot endure failed harvests. Without scribes and officials, palace redistribution falters. The whole structure is impressive because each part supports another part. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests a world whose complexity made it powerful and exposed at the same time. For ordinary people, this international system may have felt distant, yet it touched their lives constantly. A farmer in Canaan might never see the court of Egypt, but Egyptian power could shape his taxes, his local ruler's obligations, and the soldiers passing near his fields. A textile worker in a Mycenaean palace town might never board a ship, but imported metals and palace allocations determined the tools, rations, and orders around her. A sailor might know foreign harbours better than inland villages only a few days away. A smith might depend on ingots shaped like ox hides, heavy slabs of copper traded across the sea, their form practical enough to carry and distinctive enough to survive in shipwrecks and storerooms. The sea itself is both road and risk. It shortens distance, but it never removes danger. Mariners read winds, stars, currents, coastlines, and seasons. They hug shores when necessary and cross open water when skill and weather allow. Ships carry amphorae, timber, metals, wine, oil, resins, ivory, glass, and people whose names are almost never preserved. Every voyage is a calculation. A storm can destroy a cargo, pirates can seize it, a hostile port can close. Yet the rewards are great enough that traffic continues, because the palaces need what the sea provides. This is why collapse, when it comes, spreads so unnervingly. A small failure in one place can become a larger failure elsewhere. If a harvest fails, grain must be imported. If ships are unsafe, grain does not arrive. If bronze is scarce, weapons and tools suffer. If a vassal rebels, troops are diverted. If troops are diverted, a coastline is exposed. If merchants stop travelling, information slows and rumour fills the silence. No single explanation fully accounts for what will happen after 1200 BC. But the structure of the world before the storm helps explain why the damage becomes so wide. The Late Bronze Age is therefore not a simple golden age interrupted by mysterious outsiders. It is a living system, brilliant and tense, held together by trust, coercion, habit, geography, and need. Its kings seem mighty because their names are carved in stone and written on clay. Its palaces seem permanent because their walls are thick, but beneath them are ships, harvests, scribes, metals, and agreements that must keep working year after year. When they do, the world shines. When too many of them fail together, even the greatest palace becomes a storehouse waiting for fire. The sea makes the Late Bronze Age possible because it does what no road can do so cheaply it carries weight. A caravan can drag goods across dust and mountain passes, but every mile costs food, animals, guards, and time. A ship, once built and crewed, can bear heavy jars, timber beams, copper ingots, stone vessels, and sacks of grain along the coast with a kind of quiet efficiency that turns water into empire. This is why the Eastern Mediterranean does not merely border the Bronze Age world, it binds it. The same waves that glitter below palace windows are not scenery, they are infrastructure. Egypt's wealth begins with the Nile, but its wider power reaches through ports, envoys, and imported materials. The Nile gives grain, predictability, and a north-south highway inside the kingdom, yet Egypt still looks outward for what the valley cannot easily provide. Cedar from Lebanon is prized for ships, coffins, temples, and elite architecture. Copper and luxury goods arrive through long chains of exchange. Incense, resins, oils, fine woods, silver, lapis, and foreign craft objects circulate through courtly life. Pharaoh may claim to command the world from the river, but even the most self-confident kings need ships built from timber that does not grow in abundance along the Nile. Power, for all its sacred language, has a practical side. It needs wood that floats and bronze that cuts. Farther north, the Hittite Empire is more inland than maritime, but it cannot ignore the sea. Hittite control over parts of Anatolia and influence over northern Syria bring the empire close to ports that matter deeply. The coast is not just a border, it is a breathing place, where inland authority meets ships, merchants, and foreign pressure. Hittite kings deal with western Anatolian lands, Syrian vassals, and contested coastal zones because whoever controls the routes controls access to wealth. Yet that relationship is difficult. Inland empires can command roads and fortresses, but coastlines are porous. Ships appear and disappear. Allegiances shift. A city may send tribute inland while trading outward, listening to two worlds at once. Mycenaean Greece is shaped even more visibly by the sea. Its palace centres rise inland or on defensible heights, but their wealth speaks the language of maritime exchange. Mycenaean pottery travels widely across the eastern Mediterranean, appearing in Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and beyond. Some of it is ordinary enough to suggest regular trade rather than rare treasure. Some vessels carry oils or perfumed goods. Some may move as containers first and prestige objects second. The palaces of Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes do not live in isolation behind their walls. They're connected to ships, coastal landing places, and networks of exchange that turn local rulers into participants in a larger international economy. The evidence remains incomplete, but the spread of objects shows that the Aegean is not at the edge of the Bronze Age world. It is woven into it. Cyprus sits almost like a copper heart in the middle of this system. Its position makes it a meeting ground between Anatolia, Syria, the Levant, Egypt, and the Aegean. But its real importance comes from metal. Bronze gives the age its name, and copper is the essential ingredient. The island's ores feed workshops far beyond its shores. Oxhide ingots, those distinctive slabs with projecting corners, move through maritime trade and appear in shipwrecks and hoards. Their shape may have made them easier to carry, lash down, or handle. Though scholars still debate details of their production and distribution, what matters is that copper is not a local convenience. It is a strategic resource. To interrupt the flow of Cypriot copper is to touch weapons, tools, prestige goods, and the authority of palaces that depend on controlling metal. The Levantine coast, with cities such as Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Ashkelon, and others across different periods of prominence, functions as a chain of gateways. These are not merely towns by the water, they are translators between worlds. Inland routes bring grain, wool, animals, metals, and people down toward the sea. Ships bring foreign goods and foreign demands. Scribes in such cities know how to operate across cultures. Merchants learn weights, languages, customs, and risks. A port city can become rich not because it commands a vast empire, but because it stands where empires need to pass through. Its strength lies in connection. Its danger lies in exactly the same place. A lesser-known detail from this world comes from shipwreck archaeology, especially wrecks that reveal cargoes as mixed as the age itself. A single late Bronze Age vessel might carry copper ingots, tin, glass ingots, resin, pottery, ivory, jewellery, tools, weapons, and personal possessions from multiple regions. Such cargoes suggest not a simple trip from one kingdom to another, but a layered commercial world where goods accumulate, change hands, and move through complicated circuits. These ships are floating archives without writing. Their holds show a reality that royal inscriptions rarely bother to describe, the practical, crowded, risky movement of things that made elite life possible. But sea lanes are delicate. They depend on trust as much as skill. A merchant must believe that a destination port still functions. A captain must believe that the coast is not hostile. A king must believe that allies or vassals will protect harbours, provide supplies, and honour obligations. Even piracy can be tolerated at a low level if trade remains profitable and predictable. But if raids multiply, if ports burn, if officials flee, if local rulers stop enforcing order, maritime wealth can turn into maritime exposure. The sea does not have walls. A coastline cannot be defended like one palace gate. A fleet can be powerful, but it cannot be everywhere. Watchmen can scan the horizon, but they cannot know whether a sail belongs to a trader, a messenger, a pirate, a mercenary band, or a starving community seeking land. This vulnerability is easy to miss when looking at the grand names of the period: Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, Cyprus, and the Levantine kingdoms sound solid from a distance, as if each were a stone block in a political wall. Up close, they are more like knots in a net. Pull one cord too hard and tension travels elsewhere. The palaces need metals, the metals need ships, the ships need safe harbours, the harbours need stable authorities need food, soldiers, and legitimacy. If drought reduces harvests, if inland wars disrupt roads, if displaced people move toward coasts, if raiders learn that wealthy ports are poorly defended, then the very network that once magnified prosperity begins to magnify danger. The sea also spreads news, and news can become its own kind of pressure. A burned city does not remain a local secret for long if sailors survive to tell it. A shortage in one region affects prices and expectations in another. Rumours of invasion may cause rulers to hold troops at home, weakening allies elsewhere. Merchants may delay voyages, creating shortages that deepen fear. What survives in the record suggests that the late Bronze Age maritime world is not simply attacked from outside. It begins to lose confidence in its own roots, and once confidence fades, every ship becomes uncertain, every delay suspicious, every missing cargo part of a larger dread. So the sea that built the age waits quietly at the centre of its undoing. It has carried cedar to Egypt, copper from Cyprus, pottery from the Aegean, letters from kings, gifts for brides, bronze for warriors, and grain for hungry cities. It has made distant courts familiar to one another. It has allowed small coastal kingdoms to become wealthy beyond their fields. Yet it has also created a world where no power can stand entirely alone. When the horizon darkens, the danger is not only that enemies may arrive by sea, it is that everything necessary may fail to arrive at all. Long before the sea peoples appear in their most famous and terrifying form, they enter the record as shadows at the edge of other people's concerns. They are not introduced with clarity. No ancient writer pauses to explain who they are, where exactly they come from, what language they speak, or how they understand themselves. Instead, They appear in fragments a troublesome group in a military inscription, a band of foreign fighters in royal service, raiders troubling a coastline, people associated with islands or northern lands, names pressed into clay or carved into stone by states that have their own reasons for describing outsiders in particular ways. The first traces do not feel like the beginning of a single invasion. They feel more like scattered warnings in the margins of a world already accustomed to movement and violence. This matters because the Sea Peoples were not discovered as a people discovering themselves. They were assembled from hostile records, especially Egyptian ones, and from later archaeological interpretation. The phrase itself is modern, a tool of convenience used to group several peoples mentioned across different inscriptions. Ancient Egyptians speak of foreign lands, northern peoples, islanders, enemies, warriors, and named groups. But they do not give a neat category that matches the modern label. What survives in the record suggests a shifting landscape of identities, not a single nation sailing under one flag. The evidence remains incomplete, and from the beginning it is filtered through the eyes of kings who want victories to look orderly, enemies to look dangerous, and royal power to look necessary. Among the earliest figures to emerge are people such as the Sheridan, who appear before the Great Crisis of the early 12th century BC. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramses II describe Sheridan as formidable sea raiders, but they also appear later as soldiers serving in Egyptian forces. This dual role is one of the most revealing details in the entire story. A group that can be described as an enemy in one context may become a mercenary or guard in another. The Bronze Age world is not divided cleanly between civilized kingdoms and wild outsiders. It is full of hired fighters, displaced men, ambitious captains, borderland communities, and maritime specialists who can move between service, raiding, and settlement depending on opportunity. A warrior's identity may be shaped less by a national border than by his commander, his ship, his weapons, and the food he can secure. The Luca offer another early shadow, though their relationship to the later Sea Peoples remains debated. They are often associated with southwestern Anatolia and appear in texts as troublesome raiders or rebels, especially in relation to Hittite concerns and Eastern Mediterranean instability. They are not always counted among the classic Sea Peoples lists, yet they show that coastal raiding and difficult maritime populations are not sudden inventions of 1200 BC. The Late Bronze Age already contains zones where imperial control weakens near rugged coasts, islands, and borderlands. Such places can produce sailors who trade when trade is profitable, raid when defences are thin, and resist when great kings try to draw them firmly into imperial systems. The Amarna letters, written mostly in the 14th century BC, reveal another layer of this world, though they do not present the Sea Peoples as later tradition imagines them. These diplomatic tablets preserve rulers complaining, pleading, accusing rivals, and reporting threats. They show Canaanite city-states caught between local conflicts and Egyptian oversight, with small rulers trying to survive in a world dominated by larger powers. The famous troublemakers in those letters are often the Habiru, a socially disruptive category whose exact meaning scholars still debate, not the Sea Peoples. Yet the letters are useful because they show how fragile local order can be even before the final collapse. Cities depend on outside support. Rulers exaggerate danger to win help. Labels for enemies may describe social position, political rebellion, foreign origin, or simply the viewpoint of the person writing the complaint. This is a warning for reading all later sources too neatly. A less known but important point is that ancient labels often do not behave like modern ethnic names. A name in an inscription might refer to a region, a coalition, a warrior group, a ruling elite, a port community, or an outsider category imposed by someone else. It may remain stable for generations, or it may shift as groups move and mix. A man called by one name in Egypt might have been known differently at home. A group described as coming from the sea might include people who travelled by sea only recently. A people associated with islands might live partly on coasts, partly inland, and partly in the imagination of royal scribes who used geography to make foreignness feel distant. Scholars still debate many of these identifications because the ancient record gives names without biographies. The difficulty deepens because royal inscriptions are not neutral reports. They are monuments of power. When Egyptian kings describe enemies, they often place them inside a cosmic drama, Egypt as order, foreigners as chaos, Pharaoh as the one who restores balance. This does not mean the events are invented. Egypt did fight real enemies, and inscriptions can preserve valuable historical information. But the form is stylized. Numbers may be symbolic or inflated. Victories are emphasized. Defeats are omitted or softened. Foreign groups may be arranged into dramatic lists that make the threat seem vast and the king's triumph even greater. To read these texts well is to treat them neither as pure fiction nor as modern battlefield journalism. They are evidence, but evidence wearing ceremonial armor. At the same time, archaeology complicates the story in quieter ways. Pottery styles shift. Fortifications appear or are repaired. Some settlements show signs of disruption, while others show continuity. Weapons and burial practices change in certain regions. Objects associated with Aegean or Cypriot traditions appear in places along the Levantine coast, yet artifacts do not speak with one voice. A new pottery style may mean migration, trade, imitation, intermarriage, elite fashion, or a small incoming group influencing local production. Destruction layers may point to war, but fire can come from accident, rebellion, earthquake, or attack. The temptation is to connect every burned city to the same mysterious invaders, but no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. So the first shadows of the Sea Peoples are less like the opening scene of a planned conquest, and more like the gathering of loose threads. Some groups are already known as fighters or raiders. Some may come from Anatolia, the Aegean, Cyprus, or other coastal zones, but the details remain contested. Some appear inside Egyptian service before they appear as Egyptian enemies. Some names may later attach to settled communities, while others vanish into the record as quickly as they came. The world that records them is already one of movement merchants, messengers, brides, soldiers, slaves, craftsmen, sailors, and refugees, all crossing borders that modern maps make sharper than they were. By the time the Great Crisis approaches, the Eastern Mediterranean has long experience with foreign warriors and maritime danger. What changes is not the existence of raiders. It is the intensity of pressure, the number of regions affected, and the inability of palace states to absorb the shocks. The first records do not solve the mystery. They make it deeper. They show that the Sea Peoples were not sudden monsters rising from nowhere beyond the horizon. They were connected somehow to the same world they helped destabilize, moving along its routes, fighting in its armies, appearing in its fears, and slipping through the cracks of its written memory before the cracks widened into collapse. By the time Egypt begins naming the northern invaders in its royal monuments, the story has already passed from scattered trouble into something larger and more frightening. The Egyptian court does not see the crisis from the perspective of ruined Hittite towns, anxious Syrian ports, or Aegean palace centres under strain. It sees the crisis from the Nile, from a kingdom that has survived for more than 2,000 years by imagining itself as the fixed centre of order, to Egypt. Foreign danger is not merely political, it is cosmic. Beyond the cultivated valley lies the desert, the sea, the unstable edge of creation. Enemies come from those margins, and the pharaoh's task is to push them back. So when the records speak of northern peoples arriving with weapons, ships, families, and hunger, The language is never calm. It is carved in the voice of a state determined to prove that chaos has met its master. The first great Egyptian glimpse comes under Pharaoh Meneptah, son of Ramses II, near the end of the 13th century BC. Meneptah is not a young conqueror seeking fame in the manner of earlier warrior kings. He inherits a vast royal tradition and an Egypt that still appears formidable, but his inscriptions reveal a serious threat from the west. A Libyan leader pushes toward Egypt, and with him come groups described as northerners from across or near the sea. Among the names listed are peoples often connected to the wider Sea Peoples problem Shurden, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Teresh, and Lucca. The campaign is presented naturally as a magnificent Egyptian victory. The enemy is crushed, bodies are counted, captives are taken, and Pharaoh restores the proper shape of the world. Yet beneath the victory language lies something more revealing. These northerners are not presented as a small band of pirates. They are part of a coalition tied to migration, war, and pressure on Egypt's borders. The Libyan threat itself seems to involve not simply raiders, but people moving with families and possessions, seeking land as well as plunder. That detail is crucial because it complicates the image of the Sea Peoples as only seaborne warriors, already in Meneptah's reign. The problem appears mixed land attack, foreign fighters, displaced groups, and political ambition all tangled together. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that Egypt is not facing one neat enemy. It is facing the human overflow of a disturbed world. The names in Meneptah's inscriptions have tempted generations of scholars to draw maps of origins. The Lucca are often linked with southwestern Anatolia. The Shurden have been connected, controversially, to Sardinia by some scholars, though the direction and meaning of that connection remain debated. The Shekelesh have sometimes been linked to Sicily, and the Teresh to regions around western Anatolia, or later Tyrrhenian names, but these identifications are uncertain and often disputed. The Ekwesh have been associated by some with the Chians, meaning Mycenaean Greeks, though this too is not settled. The problem is not that these theories are foolish. Some are plausible in limited ways. The problem is that names carved by Egyptian scribes do not provide passports. A similarity of sound is not enough to prove a homeland, and ancient groups could move, merge, serve foreign kings, or be renamed by outsiders. What Meneptah gives us, then, is not a solved map, but an early flash of the storm. Egypt defeats a coalition, but the fact that such a coalition reaches Egyptian concern at all shows that the Mediterranean's tensions are spreading. The Nile Kingdom can still defend itself, its armies can still mobilize, its scribes can still turn victory into monumental certainty. But the northern names do not disappear, they return, decades later, in an even more dramatic form under Ramses III, whose reign preserves the most famous images of the Sea Peoples ever made. Ramses III rules in the early 12th century BC, when the wider Bronze Age world is already badly damaged. Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe a massive movement of peoples who have already laid waste to other lands before turning toward Egypt. The text places fallen powers in their path and presents the invaders as almost unstoppable until Pharaoh confronts them. The imagery is powerful warriors with feathered or crested headgear, round shields, long swords, ships with high prows tangled in battle, archers firing from Egyptian vessels and from the shore, enemies falling into the water, and ox carts carrying women, children, and goods. It is one of the rare moments when ancient propaganda also preserves a visual hint of migration. The invaders are shown not only as soldiers, but as communities on the move. This does not make the Egyptian account simple truth. Ramses III has every reason to magnify danger. A pharaoh who defeats a small raid is successful, A pharaoh who defeats a world-threatening invasion becomes the defender of creation. The inscriptions are arranged to show control, inevitability, and divine favor. The king prepares. The enemy comes. Egypt destroys them. Order returns. That is the ideological rhythm. Scholars still debate how closely the scenes reflect actual battles, whether they compress several encounters into one grand narrative, and how much the movement of peoples described by the text corresponds to events outside Egypt that Egyptian scribes only partly understood. But even allowing for exaggeration, the record points to genuine danger. Egypt is not inventing the crisis out of empty air. The land battle and naval battle described under Ramses III show how unusual the threat must have seemed. Egypt is accustomed to fighting Libyans in the west, Nubians in the south, and Asiatic powers in the northeast. But the combined image of land migration and sea attack has a different character. The Egyptian response appears carefully organized. Forces are stationed at river mouths or coastal approaches. Archers exploit Egypt's ability to fight from stable positions and from ships suited to local waters. Enemy vessels, perhaps less maneuverable in the confined battle space, become trapped. The Medinet Habu reliefs show them overturned and crowded, their crews exposed to arrows. Whether every detail is literal or stylized, the message is clear: Egypt survives because it turns the invaders' maritime strength against them. One of the most striking details is the presence of families and carts in the Egyptian scenes. Raiders seeking quick plunder do not usually bring entire households into battle zones. This does not mean every person in the movement is a refugee, nor does it mean there is no organized military threat. It suggests a mixture that is harder and more human-armed migration. People may be looking for land, safety, employment, food, or new political futures after old ones collapse. Warriors protect families, but they also attack cities. Communities flee destruction, but they may create destruction in turn. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the Sea Peoples so enduringly difficult to define. Through Meneptah and Ramses III, Egypt gives the Sea Peoples their loudest ancient voice, but that voice is Egyptian, not theirs. We do not hear the invaders explain why they move. We do not hear their grief, their ambitions, their internal divisions, or the names they use for themselves. We see them through the eyes of a kingdom that defeats them and turns them into symbols of chaos. Yet even through that filter, something real is visible, a Mediterranean in motion. Northern groups entering Egyptian history first as allies of enemies, then as a vast danger by land and sea. The monuments claim that Pharaoh has ended the threat. The wider world suggests otherwise. Egypt may hold its border, but beyond the carved walls, the old international order continues to break. The names survive with a strange kind of weight, because they are almost all we have. Shurden, Shekelesh, Peleset, Cheka, Denyen, Weshesh, Teresh, Ekwesh, Luka. They appear in Egyptian records as enemies, auxiliaries, defeated captives, or members of coalitions. Yet behind each name is a human reality that remains partly hidden. A name carved into a temple wall can feel solid, but it may be no more than the outside edge of a story. It tells us that Egyptian scribes recognized a group, or thought they did. It does not tell us how that group formed, whether its members shared one language, whether they came from one homeland, whether they had kings, whether they traveled willingly, or whether they were already the broken survivors of another collapse. This is one of the deepest problems in the study of the Sea Peoples. The records offer names without nations. Modern minds want borders, flags, ethnic identities, and clean migrations from point A to point B. The ancient world gives something messier. A people might be known by a regional label in one place, by a political label in another, by a profession somewhere else, and by an enemy's insult in a royal inscription. A warrior band could gather men from several backgrounds and still be remembered under one name. A coastal community could split, with some members serving as mercenaries, some raiding, some settling, and some remaining at home. The evidence remains incomplete, and the temptation to turn each name into a neat homeland has led to some of the most attractive but uncertain theories in Bronze Age history. The Sherden show the problem clearly. They are among the best-known names, appearing as sea raiders in Egyptian texts before later serving in Egyptian forces. Their distinctive horned helmets with a central disc, as shown in Egyptian art, have become one of the iconic images of the period. Some scholars have connected the Sherden to Sardinia, partly because of the similarity between the names, and because later Sardinian archaeology includes impressive Bronze Age warrior imagery. But the connection is debated. It is not clear whether Sherden came from Sardinia, moved to Sardinia, had some indirect relation to the Western Mediterranean, or simply carried a name that sounds familiar to modern ears. What survives in the record suggests mobility, but it does not preserve a travel diary. The Shekelesh present a similar puzzle. Their name has often been compared with Sicily or the Sicils, but again the link is uncertain. Sound resemblance can be seductive, especially when later classical geography offers names that seem to echo Bronze Age inscriptions. Yet centuries stand between the records, and peoples can move, change names, absorb neighbours, or be renamed by outsiders. A name that appears in Egypt around 1200 BC and a name known from later Italy may be connected. But resemblance alone is not proof. Scholars still debate these identifications because the evidence has to be built from fragments, inscriptions, pottery patterns, weapons, settlement changes, and the slow movement of cultural traits across seas. The Peliset are perhaps the most famous because many scholars connect them with the Philistines of the southern Levant. Here the evidence is stronger than for some other groups, though still not simple. After the upheavals of the early 12th century BC, new cultural patterns appear in parts of coastal Canaan, especially in places later associated with Philistine cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Pottery styles show Aegean influence, and other features suggest newcomers or communities with strong connections to the Aegean world. But even here, the story is not one of a pure people landing unchanged on a new shore. The Philistine culture that emerges is mixed. It absorbs local Canaanite traditions, Egyptian influences, and incoming elements. Over time, whatever foreign identity the first settlers carried becomes part of a new Levantine reality. The Cheka, another group named in Egyptian sources, may also have settled along the Levantine coast, perhaps around Dor, though the identification remains debated. They appear in later Egyptian-related narratives as maritime people in the region, suggesting that some groups once portrayed as invaders became part of the political landscape of the coast. This is an important shift. The sea peoples are not only attackers who vanish after battle. Some become neighbours, some become rulers, some become the ancestors of communities that later history treats as local. Collapse does not simply erase people, it rearranges them. The Denian have been linked by some scholars to the Danaans, a Homeric name for Greeks, or to regions of Anatolia and the northern Levant. The Weshesh are even more elusive, with proposals ranging widely and little firm evidence to anchor them. The Tresh have been connected by some to the Tyrrhenians, possibly related to later Etruscans, while the Ekwesh have been compared with Achaeans. These ideas are intriguing, and some may preserve real memories of movement from the Aegean or Western Anatolia, but they must be handled carefully. The world after the Bronze Age collapse is full of later traditions trying to explain origins. Not every echo is a map. A lesser-known detail is that some sea peoples' names may not refer to whole populations at all. They might refer to military elites, clans, maritime confederations, or groups identified by the Egyptians because of their fighting style rather than their ancestry. If a band of Sherden warriors served Egypt, their name in Egyptian records might become associated with a military role. If similar-looking fighters later appeared among enemies, scribes might use the same label even if the group had changed. Ancient categorization is not modern anthropology. It is practical, political, and sometimes imprecise. The images add another layer. Egyptian reliefs show different costumes, helmets, shields, and ships, and these details have been studied intensely. Feathered headdresses are often associated with the Peliset and related groups. Horned helmets are linked to Sheridan. Round shields, long swords, and particular ship forms suggest broad connections with Mediterranean warrior traditions. Yet art also follows convention. Egyptian artists were skilled observers, but they worked within symbolic systems. They might emphasize difference to make enemies recognizable. They might repeat established visual types. The reliefs are invaluable, but they do not give us a photographic record. What becomes clear is that the Sea Peoples were probably not one people at all. They were a cluster of named groups moving through a collapsing world, sometimes together, sometimes separately, sometimes as enemies of Egypt, sometimes as servants of Egypt, sometimes as settlers in lands that had belonged to older political systems. Their identities may have been as unstable as the age itself. A man could be born in an Aegean-speaking community, serve in a foreign army, marry into a Levantine port town, and die under a name given to him by Egyptian scribes. His children might become something else entirely. This is why the mystery should not be reduced to a hunt for a single homeland. The more important question is how so many groups became mobile at the same time, and why powerful states could no longer manage them. The names are clues, but they are also reminders of silence. We know what frightened kingdoms called these people. We rarely know what they called themselves. And so the Sea Peoples remain suspended between history and shadow, named clearly enough to haunt the record, but not clearly enough to become nations on a map. By the time the great palace world begins to burn, the names on Egyptian walls are only one part of a much wider silence forming across the eastern Mediterranean. The collapse is not visible from one place alone. It appears in layers of ash under ruined floors, in tablets baked accidentally by fire, in abandoned storerooms, in broken fortification walls, in weapons left where they fell, and in the sudden disappearance of administrative habits that once seemed ordinary. A palace can die in a night, but a palace system dies in stages. First the supplies become uncertain, then the messengers fail to arrive, then the ruler cannot command the countryside as before, then the fire comes, or the people leave, or both. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palace centres show the violence and confusion of this transformation with particular force. At Pylos, the palace is destroyed by fire near the end of the 13th century BC, and the Linear B tablets, never meant to last, are preserved because the flames harden them. These tablets are not grand histories. They are inventories, lists, assignments, and administrative notes. Yet some of their final concerns feel tense. They mention coast watchers, rowers, and preparations that may point to fear of attack from the sea, though scholars still debate the exact meaning. There is no dramatic final chronicle, no named enemy, no proud last speech. There is bureaucracy on the edge of disaster, and then there is ash. Mycenae and Tiryns, with their massive walls and monumental gateways, also suffer destruction and disruption. Their stones are so huge that later Greeks imagined only giants could have moved them. But even walls that inspire myths cannot preserve a system once its foundations weaken. Some sites are rebuilt in reduced form. Some continue with changed patterns of occupation. Others lose the administrative complexity that had defined them. The collapse in Greece is not absolute extinction. People remain, speak, farm, bury their dead, remember, and adapt. But the palace-centered world that produced Linear B writing does not recover. The script disappears for centuries. That disappearance is one of the starkest signs of collapse, When writing exists mainly to serve palace administration, the fall of the palace can make writing unnecessary, or at least unsupported. Across Anatolia, the Hittite Empire also fractures. Hattusa, the great capital, is abandoned or destroyed around this period. Though the exact sequence remains debated, the city's temples, gates, archives, and defensive walls had once embodied imperial authority across central Anatolia and northern Syria. Yet by the early 12th century BC, the empire as a unified great power is gone. Some Hittite traditions continue in smaller Neo-Hittite and Luwian-speaking kingdoms farther south and east, especially in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. But the old imperial structure has collapsed. This distinction matters. Civilizations rarely vanish as completely as ruins suggest. States fall, people continue, names change, languages survive in altered settings. The Hittite imperial centre disappears, but fragments of its culture move into a new political landscape. On the Syrian coast, Ugarit offers one of the most haunting windows into the end. The city is wealthy, literate, international, and deeply tied to trade. Its archives contain letters, legal texts, myths, administrative records, and diplomatic communications. They show a city connected to Egypt, Cyprus, the Hittites, and the wider Levant. Then, near the beginning of the 12th century BC, Ugarit is destroyed and not rebuilt as the same kind of power. Some of its final letters appear to speak from within the crisis. Enemy ships are reported. Troops and ships are absent elsewhere. Appeals for help move through the diplomatic network, but help cannot arrive in time. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every tablet can be placed with perfect confidence in the final days. Yet the atmosphere is unmistakable. A city that depends on connection finds itself dangerously alone. There is a grim irony in Ugarit's preservation. Its archives survive because the city burns. The fire that ends its living bureaucracy turns fragile clay into archaeological memory. In that memory, the collapse feels less like a single invasion and more like the failure of response. A port city can endure danger if allies function. Fleets are available, and authorities can coordinate defense. But if the king's ships are elsewhere, if the Hittite world is breaking, if Cyprus is under pressure, if inland routes are unsafe, and if enemies move quickly along the coast, then even a rich city becomes exposed. The sea peoples may be part of the immediate threat, but the deeper terror is that the network itself no longer answers. Farther south along the Levantine coast, destruction and change appear at several sites. Though the pattern is uneven, some cities burn, some shrink, some are rebuilt under new cultural influences. Egyptian control in Canaan weakens over time, and the political map begins to change. The old Late Bronze Age system of vassal city-states tied to great power diplomacy gives way gradually to a more fragmented Iron Age world. The change is not clean or instant. There are continuities in population. Pottery, diet, worship, and local practice. But the old order of Egyptian garrisons, palace elites, and international correspondence loses much of its force. Into that opening come new groups, including those later associated with the Philistine cities. Cyprus Moss too shows disruption and transformation. Some settlements are destroyed or abandoned, while others continue or even grow. The island remains important, but its role changes as bronze networks falter and new patterns of exchange emerge. Because Cyprus sits between so many regions, its archaeological record is especially complicated. Aegean-style objects, local traditions, Levantine contacts, and signs of stress all overlap. Scholars still debate how much of the change reflects migration, trade reorientation, internal development, or violence. What survives suggests not a simple conquest of the island, but a turbulent reshaping of communities at the centre of maritime exchange. The destruction layers across the eastern Mediterranean have often tempted people to imagine one terrible wave of invaders sweeping everything away. It is a powerful image, but too simple. The fires do not all burn in the same year. The causes are not identical at every site. Some places may fall to external attack, some to civil conflict, some to opportunistic raiding, some to abandonment after economic failure, and some to combinations that can no longer be separated. No single explanation fully accounts for this pattern. The palace world burns in many places, but the match is not always held by the same hand. What links these ruins is the breakdown of a shared system. Palaces that once recorded, stored, commanded, and redistributed lose their ability to function. Long-distance exchange contracts, royal diplomacy weakens. Great kings disappear from correspondence because their courts are gone or diminished. Local communities face decisions that leave little trace stay or flee, fight or submit, rebuild or move inland, preserve old customs or adopt new ones. A destruction layer shows a moment of violence, yet it does not show all the hunger, fear, calculation, and exhaustion that came before. The Sea Peoples move through this burning landscape like both cause and symptom. In some cities, they may have been attackers. In others, people like them may have been hired defenders, settlers, or refugees seeking a place in the wreckage. Their importance lies not only in what they destroyed, but in what their movement reveals. The old world had become permeable. Boundaries that once seemed managed by kings were now crossed by armed groups, displaced families, and ambitious leaders. The palace gates could still be massive, but the authority behind them was thinning. And so the burning of the palace world is not merely a series of ruins. It is the disappearance of a way of organizing life. The scribes fall silent, the storerooms empty, the sea lanes become uncertain, the great capitals lose their gravity. In the ashes, people survive, but they survive differently. The Age of Bronze kings, brother kings, diplomatic gifts, and palace archives is passing into memory. And the fires along the coast are only the brightest signs of a deeper collapse already moving through the dark. Behind the burning cities and broken palace gates lies a slower disaster, one that does not leave sword marks on bones or heroic battle scenes on temple walls. It begins in fields. It begins with clouds that do not gather, rivers that run lower than expected, springs that weaken, and farmers looking at soil that no longer behaves like memory says it should. A palace can command labour, store grain, and send orders across a kingdom, but it cannot order rain to fall. In the years around the late Bronze Age collapse, climate stress appears to have tightened its grip across parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, adding hunger to a world already strained by war, debt, rivalry, and dependence on long-distance exchange. The evidence for drought is not a single document announcing catastrophe. It comes from many kinds of traces, each partial, each requiring care pollen records showing changes in vegetation, lake and marsh sediments suggesting drier conditions, tree ring data from nearby regions pointing to episodes of reduced growth, and written hints of famine, grain shortage, and desperate appeal. Scholars still debate the timing, severity, and geography of these climate shifts, because ancient climate is never perfectly uniform. One valley may suffer more than another, one kingdom may have reserves while another starves, yet the wider pattern suggests that drought and food insecurity played a serious role in making the Bronze Age system more brittle. This is where the palace economy reveals both its strength and weakness. In good years, palace storage is protection. Grain collected from the countryside can feed workers, soldiers, priests, and dependents. Surplus allows kings to sponsor building projects, support craftsmen, and survive local shortages. But in repeated bad years, the same system becomes dangerous. If harvests fail across broad regions, there is less to collect. If the palace still demands its share, villages suffer. If the palace reduces rations, workers and soldiers lose loyalty. If grain must be imported, then ships, ports, and allies become matters of life and death. Hunger turns trade from profit into survival. In the Hittite world, texts from the broader period show deep concern with grain supplies. The Hittite heartland in Anatolia is vulnerable to shortages, and there are indications that grain from places such as Egypt or Syria could matter in times of need. When a great inland empire depends on food moving through contested territories and coastal systems, drought becomes political. It is not just bad weather. It is pressure on roads, vassals, storehouses, and diplomatic relationships. A hungry army is harder to control. A hungry city is harder to defend. A hungry subject population may rebel, flee, or welcome anyone who promises relief. Egypt, protected by the Nile more than many of its neighbours, is not immune. The Nile's flood can make Egypt astonishingly resilient, but variations in flood levels still matter. Even when Egypt has grain, that grain becomes a strategic resource in a hungry world. A kingdom with food attracts envoys, migrants, raiders, and enemies. The Egyptian image of foreign peoples pressing toward the delta may reflect not only military ambition, but the pull of a land that still seems capable of feeding people. To starving communities beyond Egypt's borders, the Nile Valley is not an abstract symbol of cosmic order. It is bread. The human consequences of drought rarely appear in royal inscriptions, because kings prefer to record victories rather than empty stomachs. But hunger changes history at ground level. Families sell possessions. Farmers abandon marginal land. Young men hire themselves as mercenaries. Coastal people turn to raiding when trade no longer feeds them. Local rulers seize supplies from weaker neighbours. Refugees move toward ports, river valleys, or fortified towns. A community that begins by seeking food may become an armed threat simply because unarmed hunger is easily crushed. What survives in the record suggests that the Sea Peoples may have included such displaced groups, people pushed into motion by pressures larger than any single battle. This does not mean drought created the Sea Peoples by itself. No single explanation fully accounts for this. People do not become named coalitions of warriors, sailors, migrants, and settlers merely because of dry weather. Political weakness matters. Trade disruption matters. Existing traditions of raiding and mercenary service matter. Ambitious leaders matter. But drought can turn every other problem sharper. It can make local conflict more violent, make migration more urgent, make kings more desperate, and make a wealthy port look less like a trading partner than a storehouse waiting to be taken. A lesser-known detail is that famine can travel even where drought does not. If one region fails, it pulls grain from another. Prices rise, ships are diverted, rulers hoard supplies, merchants avoid unsafe routes. A city that has enough grain for itself may still suffer because the political relationships around it begin to collapse under the demands of others. In a tightly connected world, hunger becomes contagious. It moves through obligations, markets, tribute systems, and fear. A bad harvest inland can create danger at sea. A shortage in Anatolia can affect a port in Syria. A failed shipment can turn diplomacy into accusation. The system that once spread abundance now spreads anxiety. This pressure may help explain why some movements associated with the Sea Peoples seem to include families and carts, not just fighters. People carrying households are not merely pirates looking for a quick raid, they are people seeking a future somewhere else. Yet migration under armed conditions is rarely peaceful. A desperate group entering another land threatens those already living there, especially when food is scarce. Local communities resist. Violence follows. The newcomers may raid because they are hungry, and the settled population may call them invaders because that is how hunger appears from behind a wall. At the same time, famine can hollow out states before enemies arrive. A palace that cannot feed its workers loses its craftsmen. A king who cannot reward soldiers loses his army. A city that cannot maintain walls, ships, and watch posts becomes vulnerable. Scribes may continue to write as if the system still functions, but writing does not fill granaries. The old machinery of command depends on the belief that obedience will be repaid with protection and food. Once that belief fails, authority becomes brittle. It may stand upright for a while, like a dry reed, then break suddenly under a pressure that would once have been manageable. The sea peoples, seen through this lens, are not simply destroyers descending on a healthy world. They are part of a broader landscape of desperation. Some may have been opportunists, some may have been professional fighters, some may have been communities uprooted by drought, famine, and political collapse. Some may have been all of these at different moments. The tragedy of the late Bronze Age is that hunger does not produce innocence. It produces movement, fear, violence, and choices made under narrowing skies. So beyond the famous battles and carved enemy names, there is another image fields under a hard sun, storehouses guarded more tightly, ships expected with grain and not yet visible, officials counting rations that cannot stretch far enough, families deciding whether to stay until nothing remains or leave while they still have strength. The collapse of empires begins in such quiet arithmetic. A little less rain, a little less grain, a few more mouths at the gate, a few more ships that do not arrive, then somewhere along the coast the watchmen see sails. While hunger tightens slowly in the fields, the earth itself may also have been moving beneath the Bronze Age world. Around the eastern Mediterranean, cities stand on restless ground, where tectonic plates press, faults slip, coastlines rise or sink, and earthquakes arrive without warning. A palace can prepare for war. It can store grain against famine. It can hire guards against raiders. But it cannot negotiate with a fault line. In a few moments, walls that took generations to build can crack open. Gateways can twist. Roof beams can fall into storerooms. Fires can break out from lamps, hearths, and shattered buildings. Survivors may stagger into streets already filling with dust, unable to know whether the disaster is over or only beginning. The idea that earthquakes contributed to the late Bronze Age collapse has attracted serious attention because many cities in the region show destruction that could be consistent with seismic damage. The eastern Mediterranean lies near active fault systems, and earthquakes are not rare intrusions into history there. They are part of the landscape's deep behaviour. Some scholars have suggested that a sequence of earthquakes, sometimes called an earthquake storm, may have struck different areas over several decades, weakening cities already under pressure. The evidence remains incomplete, and earthquakes cannot explain every destruction layer. Still, they may help account for the strange pattern of damage across places that were also suffering from political, economic, and military stress. An earthquake does not need to destroy an empire directly to change history. It only needs to make existing problems harder to solve. If a palace wall collapses in a peaceful, prosperous age, rulers can organize repairs, feed workers, bring timber and stone, and restore authority through reconstruction. But if the same wall falls during drought, trade disruption, rebellion, or foreign attack, repair becomes far more difficult. The treasury may be strained, labourers may be hungry, timber may not arrive, officials may be dealing with military emergencies. A damaged city becomes a vulnerable city, and vulnerability invites enemies who might never have succeeded against intact defences. This is the more subtle role of natural disaster in the Bronze Age collapse. It is rarely a single blow. It is a multiplier, A cracked harbour installation can reduce trade. A collapsed granary can spoil food. A damaged gate can weaken defence. A ruined temple can shake public confidence. Because temples are not only religious buildings, they are economic and symbolic centres. If a palace is the place where order is counted, stored, and displayed, then earthquake damage to that palace is not just architectural, it is psychological. The people see that the centre can break. At some sites, archaeologists have found signs that may indicate sudden structural collapse walls fallen in patterns suggestive of seismic movement, crushed rooms, tilted blocks, or damage followed by fire. Yet the interpretation is difficult. A city destroyed in war may burn and collapse. A city struck by earthquake may burn afterward and later be looted. A damaged town may be abandoned, then raided, then resettled. Archaeology often preserves the final condition of destruction better than the sequence that produced it. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, and the difference between earthquake damage and human violence is not always clean after more than 3,000 years. The danger is especially clear in heavily built palace centres, Mycenaean citadels, Hittite fortifications, and Levantine urban sites rely on stone walls, mud brick superstructures, timber roofing, storage rooms, stairways, and crowded administrative areas. Their mass gives them strength, but also danger when the ground shakes. Heavy masonry can crush, mud brick can slump, roof beams can ignite if lamps or cooking fires are overturned. Large storage jars can shatter and spilling oil, wine, or grain. A disaster that begins underground may end as fire above ground, leaving an ash layer that looks, at first glance, like an attack. Earthquakes also disrupt water systems. Wells may be damaged, springs altered, cisterns cracked, channels blocked, and harbour facilities shifted. In a dry period, this matters enormously. A city already worried about grain cannot easily endure damage to water storage. A port already anxious about ships cannot afford a broken quay. A palace already struggling to maintain authority cannot ignore collapsed temples and frightened populations. When people interpret disaster through religion, politics, and rumour, the shaking of the earth may be read as divine anger, royal failure, or a sign that old protections no longer hold. There is a lesser-known human consequence of seismic disaster. It creates refugees even without war. Families whose houses collapse need shelter. Farmers whose terraces or water systems are damaged may leave land temporarily or permanently. Craftsmen whose workshops are destroyed need new patrons. Officials whose records are lost may lose control over taxes, labour, and property claims. In an administrative world based on tablets, seals, storerooms, and measured obligations, physical destruction can become legal and economic confusion. Who owes grain if the archive is gone? Who controls land if the local ruler dies? Who distributes rations if the storehouse is burned? Disorder grows in the cracks. Earthquakes may also help explain why some communities fortify, relocate, or change settlement patterns during and after the collapse. People do not always rebuild where disaster has struck, especially if danger from enemies follows. A coastal town damaged by earthquake may be abandoned for a more defensible inland site. A palace whose walls fall may be repaired in haste, only to fail politically a generation later. A harbour that once made a city wealthy may become a liability if damaged infrastructure and unsafe seas combine. The landscape of survival shifts. Still, it would be misleading to imagine earthquakes as the hidden master cause behind the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are human actors, not aftershocks with helmets. Egyptian records describe real conflicts. Levantine and Aegean sites show cultural changes that cannot be reduced to geology. Drought, famine, trade failure, political rebellion, and migration all have their own force. Earthquakes belong in the story because they help explain how a complex system can become overwhelmed. not because they replace the people moving through that system. The old world did not fall simply because the ground shook. It fell because, when the ground shook, too many other supports were already weakening. The image, then, is not of one catastrophe but of convergence. A dry year leaves less grain. A trade route becomes unsafe. A vassal hesitates. A palace delays repairs. A tremor cracks the walls. A second shock brings down what the first weakened. Fires spread. People leave. Raiders hear that a once rich city is exposed. Families from elsewhere, themselves displaced, arrive armed and desperate. The city that later appears in the archaeological record as a destruction layer may have died from all of these things together, each one making the next more likely. In that sense, the broken cities of the Late Bronze Age resemble the broken systems behind them. Their stones preserve the physical form of a wider failure. Walls split like alliances, roofs collapse like trade routes, archives burn like diplomatic memory. The Earth's violence does not explain the entire mystery, but it gives the collapse a deeper instability, as if the age is being shaken from below while pressed from every side, and when the dust settles, those who survive look out from damaged gates toward a world where even stone has become uncertain. The harder one looks at the sea peoples, the less they resemble a single army, and the more they begin to look like several kinds of human crisis wearing the same armor. They're called raiders because cities burn. They're called migrants because families appear in the Egyptian scenes. They're called mercenaries because some of the same names turn up in Egyptian service. They're called invaders because kingdoms describe them as enemies. They are called refugees because the world around them is collapsing. Each label catches part of the truth, but none can hold all of it. No single explanation fully accounts for this movement of people across the Late Bronze Age Mediterranean, and perhaps the mistake is expecting one explanation to do so. Piracy is the simplest image, and it is not wrong. The Mediterranean has always offered opportunities for those willing to use ships violently. A coastline full of wealthy ports, cargo vessels, and palace storehouses is an invitation to raiders, especially when central authority weakens. A pirate does not need to defeat an empire. He needs to find the moment when watchmen are few, local troops are absent, and a warehouse door can be forced before help arrives. In a world where copper, tin, grain, oil, and luxury goods move by sea, maritime violence can be profitable. It can also be politically useful. One king's pirate may be another king's hired disruptor, and one raiding band may become a respectable military unit when a palace puts it on the payroll. But piracy alone is too small for the evidence. The great Egyptian scenes of Ramses III do not show only swift raiders arriving for plunder. They show carts, women, children, and possessions. Royal art can exaggerate or arrange reality, but this detail is difficult to ignore. It suggests people on the move with more than weapons. A raider wants loot and escape. A migrant wants a place to live. An armed migrant wants both survival and leverage. Such groups can attack like armies and travel like refugees, because their need is not temporary. They are not merely stealing from the old world. They may be trying to enter the ruins of it. Mercenary service adds another layer. The Late Bronze Age is full of foreign fighters. Kings value skilled warriors, especially those with distinctive weapons, ships, or battlefield reputations. The Shurden, for example, appear as both enemies and members of Egyptian forces. This tells us that identity is flexible in practice. A group feared as raiders along one coast can become elite guards in another kingdom. Men trained in violence follow food, pay, honor, and opportunity. When palace systems are stable, they can absorb such fighters and turn them into instruments of royal power. When palace systems fail, those same fighters may become independent, predatory, or attached to migrating communities that need protection. There may also have been ambitious leaders among them, men who understood that collapse creates openings. When great kingdoms are strong, a local warlord remains local. When great kingdoms weaken, he can gather ships, displaced families, unemployed soldiers, and desperate allies into something larger. This may be how some Sea Peoples coalitions formed not as ancient nations marching in ethnic unity, but as temporary confederations built around movement and opportunity. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the pattern is familiar from many periods of history. People uprooted by crisis often do not move as helpless crowds. They organize, they arm themselves, they follow leaders who promise land, plunder, safety, or revenge. Refugee movement, however, must not be softened into innocence. A hungry, displaced population can become terrifying to those already living on the land it seeks. If a coastal city has grain, walls, and wells, then people outside those walls may view it as salvation, while people inside view the newcomers as disaster. The same group can be victims in one landscape and aggressors in another. That moral ambiguity is central to the Sea Peoples. They may have been fleeing drought, destroyed towns, political breakdown, or violence from other groups. Yet when they arrived at new shores, they could bring violence with them. Survival does not prevent brutality. Sometimes it demands it. The theory of mass migration also fits the wider pattern of the age. Around the same broad period, the old palace centres of the Aegean are breaking apart. Hittite authority is collapsing, Levantine ports are under pressure, and Cyprus is changing. People connected to these regions may have moved in different directions, not as one planned invasion, but as many streams of displacement. Some might have travelled by ship, others moved over land through Anatolia and Syria. Some joined Libyan coalitions pressing toward Egypt, others settled in Canaan, others disappeared into populations that left no clear label behind. What Egyptian monuments compress into named enemy groups may actually reflect years of motion across several regions. There is also the possibility of internal rebellion blending with external attack. Palace societies create inequality. They demand labour, collect taxes, control resources, and rely on dependent workers. When conditions worsen, people inside the system may turn against it. A city burned by enemies from the sea may also contain locals who opened gates, refused service, or joined attackers. A palace destroyed in a time of famine may fall as much from internal resentment as foreign assault. Archaeology rarely preserves loyalty. It preserves burned floors and broken jars. Scholars still debate how much of the collapse should be understood as invasion, migration, civil unrest, or systemic failure, because these forces can operate together in the same event. This blended explanation is less dramatic than a single horde sweeping across the sea, but it is more convincing. The Sea Peoples likely included pirates, but were not only pirates. They included migrants, but were not only helpless refugees. They included warriors, but were not always formal armies. They included people from multiple origins, but were not one nation. They moved through a world where old authorities had lost the ability to manage violence, hunger, and mobility in such a world. Categories break down. A ship can carry traders one year and raiders the next. A mercenary can become a settler. A refugee camp can become an army. A defeated enemy can become a neighbour. The Sea Peoples therefore force a different way of seeing collapse. They are not simply the cause of the Bronze Age disaster, standing outside history and striking it down. They are also products of that disaster, shaped by the same droughts, broken trade routes, failed palaces, and violent opportunities that they helped intensify. They are the human form of systemic failure. Where the sea lanes once carried controlled exchange, they now carry uncontrolled movement. Where kings once hired foreign warriors, those warriors now appear beyond command. Where palaces once stored surplus, hungry people now see targets. Where borders once had meaning, desperation makes them porous. To call them destroyers is not false, but it is incomplete. To call them victims is not false, but it is incomplete too. They belong to the grey space where survival, ambition, violence, and displacement meet. That is why they remain so unsettling. They do not fit neatly into the comforting categories of history. They are not simply barbarians at the gate, nor noble refugees seeking peace, nor professional pirates chasing treasure. They are what happens when a connected world breaks and people begin moving through its fractures, armed with old skills, new desperation, and no easy way back. Egypt survives because Egypt is not yet broken in the same way as the lands beyond its northeastern frontier. The old kingdom of the Nile is strained, threatened, and watching the world around it darken. But it still has something many neighbours have lost: a functioning centre. Orders can still move from palace to officials, from officials to garrisons, from garrisons to the edges of the delta. Grain can still be gathered, soldiers can still be fed. Ships can still be prepared for battle in waters Egypt knows well. When Ramses III presents himself as the ruler who stops the northern invaders, the monument is full of royal exaggeration, but beneath the carved certainty there is a real strategic fact. Egypt holds the line because its state machinery, though aging, still works well enough at the crucial moment. The danger approaches through the same vulnerable corridor that has always mattered to Egypt: the northeastern routes through Canaan and the approaches to the Nile Delta. For centuries, Egypt has looked beyond the Sinai not out of curiosity alone, but out of necessity. Whoever controls the southern Levant can either buffer Egypt or threaten it. Armies, migrants, traders, raiders, and diplomats all pass through that zone. The delta itself is rich, broad, and tempting, with waterways that can feed and confuse an enemy. To outsiders under pressure, Egypt must have seemed like the last great storehouse of the old world, a place where grain, land, and royal wealth still exist while other kingdoms burn. To Egyptian officials, that same attraction is terrifying. Ramses III's inscriptions describe the invaders as if they have already destroyed other lands before turning toward Egypt. The text names peoples known from the wider Sea Peoples problem and presents their movement as overwhelming, a force that no land could stand against until Pharaoh intervenes. This is propaganda, but propaganda often preserves the shape of genuine fear. The Egyptians do not depict a minor border raid. They depict a combined threat, with movement by land and sea, with warriors and households, with ships and carts, with enemies who seem to be seeking not simply loot but settlement. The evidence remains incomplete, and the scenes may compress several encounters, but the crisis they dramatize is not imaginary. The Egyptian response appears deliberate. Ramses III claims to have prepared his frontier, organized his forces, and trapped the enemy in a situation where their mobility becomes a weakness. On land, Egypt can use fortified positions, archers, chariotry, infantry, and knowledge of the terrain. At sea, the battle is not fought on the open Mediterranean, where enemy ships might maneuver freely, but in controlled coastal or delta waters where Egyptian forces can use the shore as part of the battlefield. The famous naval reliefs show enemy vessels crowded together, their high-ended ships tangled and vulnerable, while Egyptian archers fire from boats and from land. Men fall into the water, ships capsize. The sea, once the road of danger, becomes a killing ground. One surprising detail is that Egypt's victory may have depended less on having a superior blue water navy and more on turning geography into a weapon. The Nile Delta is not just coastline. It is a maze of channels, marshy approaches, river mouths, sandbars, and narrow passages. A fleet that is dangerous in open water can become trapped in restricted space. Enemy ships carrying warriors and possibly families are not ideal for delicate maneuver under missile fire. Egyptian archers, stable platforms, and prepared positions could transform a maritime invasion into something closer to an ambush. The temple reliefs are stylized, but the tactical logic behind them is plausible. Still, the reliefs do not show the cost to Egypt with equal honesty. Royal monuments almost never linger over exhaustion, damaged fields, frightened villages, dead common soldiers, or the strain of mobilization. They show the pharaoh larger than everyone else, calm amid violence, restoring order by divine authority. But a battle like this is not won by symbolism alone. It requires men rowing, drawing bows, standing in mud, guarding supply lines, repairing equipment, and facing enemies who have already survived enough hardship to reach Egypt's border. The victory belongs to the Egyptian state, but it is paid for by people whose names do not appear in the stone. After the battle, Ramses III presents captives, counts hands, displays defeated foreigners, and folds the event into the ancient Egyptian rhythm of order, triumphing over chaos. In the official image, Egypt has not merely survived, it has proven itself eternal. Yet the wider history is more sobering. Egypt wins the battle, but it does not reverse the collapse of the late Bronze Age world. The Hittite Empire does not return as it was. Ugarit is not restored to its old life. Mycenaean palace administration does not revive. The old diplomatic web remains torn. Egypt has defended its border, but the international system that once magnified Egyptian prestige is disappearing around it. This is one of the great ironies of Ramses III's victory. He may have saved Egypt from invasion, but not from decline. In the years after his reign, Egypt faces internal troubles, economic pressure, labor unrest, political conspiracy, and a gradual reduction of power abroad. The kingdom does not collapse in the same abrupt way as some of its neighbors, but it becomes more inward-looking and less able to dominate the Levant as before. Egyptian influence continues, but the great imperial confidence of the new kingdom fades. Holding the line is not the same as holding the world together. The sea peoples themselves do not simply vanish after defeat. Some groups may be settled by Egypt in controlled territories. Others may establish themselves along the Levantine coast. Some are absorbed into local populations. Some disappear from the record because their names no longer serve the purposes of Egyptian scribes. Defeat at the Delta does not mean total destruction. Ancient battles rarely erase whole peoples. More often, they redirect them. Warriors become captives, settlers, servants, rivals, or neighbors. Families who survive continue seeking land and food. The movement changes form. Ramses III's victory therefore stands at a threshold. On one side is the old Egyptian vision pharaoh against chaos, Egypt preserved, enemies crushed. On the other side is the historical reality, a transformed Mediterranean, where old empires are weaker, ports are changing hands, and new communities are taking shape from the wreckage. Egypt's monuments try to freeze the moment as triumph. Archaeology shows that time keeps moving. The line is held. But beyond it, the Bronze Age has already slipped away. And perhaps that is why the battle remains so powerful. It is not simply a scene of Egyptian military success. It is one of the last bright flashes of the old palace world defending itself in the language it understands: kingship, order, walls, ships, archers, and carved certainty. Ramses III stands victorious on stone, but behind the victory is a quieter truth. Egypt has survived the storm at its door. It has not stopped the storm from changing the world. After Egypt holds the line, the story of the Sea Peoples does not end on the battlefield. It spreads into quieter places, into settlements, cooking pots, burial grounds, rebuilt towns, abandoned ruins, and new patterns of life along the coasts. The great Egyptian reliefs freeze them as defeated enemies. But history does not freeze so easily. People who survive defeat still need land, food, water, protection, and a future for their children. Some are captured, some are settled under authority. Some move on, some blend into local communities so thoroughly that only fragments of pottery, architecture, diet, and names suggest their arrival. The sea peoples, once seen as a wave of destruction, begin to dissolve into the Iron Age world they help create. Nowhere is this more debated than in southern Canaan, where the people later known as Philistines become one of the clearest possible heirs of the upheaval. Egyptian records name the Peliset among the groups defeated by Ramses III, and later biblical and Near Eastern traditions place the Philistines along the southern Levantine coast, in cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Archaeology shows that around the early Iron Age, this region undergoes a striking cultural change. New pottery styles appear with strong Aegean connections. Certain food habits shift. Architectural and household patterns show new influences. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that people with roots or connections in the Aegean world settled among the local Canaanite population and gradually formed a new coastal culture. The important word is gradually. The Philistines do not appear as a sealed foreign tribe dropped unchanged onto the Levant. Their early material culture shows outside influences, but their later identity becomes deeply local. They adopt and adapt Canaanite language, gods, artistic forms, and political habits. Their cities become part of the Levantine landscape, not permanent colonies of a distant homeland. This is how migration often works in the ancient world. The first generation may remember a different sea, different songs, different weapons, and different ancestors. The second generation grows among new neighbours. The third generation belongs to a place that did not exist in the same way before they arrived. Scholars still debate how large the incoming population was, how violent the settlement process became, and how directly it connects to the Peliset of Egyptian texts. But the broad picture points to mixture rather than replacement. A lesser-known detail comes from food remains, especially the appearance of certain animal consumption patterns in early Philistine contexts. Some sites show evidence for eating pork at levels that differ from many surrounding highland communities, though the pattern changes over time. This is not a simple ethnic fingerprint, because food habits can shift for many reasons, but it offers a glimpse of everyday identity below royal records. Empires describe enemies in battle. Archaeology finds what people cooked. A cooking pot may tell a slower truth than a victory inscription. Newcomers do not only fight, they eat, build, marry, trade, worship, and become neighbours. Farther north along the Levantine coast, other groups associated with the Sea Peoples may have settled as well. The Cheka have often been linked with the region around Dor, though the identification remains debated. Later Egyptian tales and archaeological interpretations suggest maritime communities active along this coast after the collapse, occupying spaces once tied to older Late Bronze Age systems. These were not necessarily great kingdoms at first. They may have been port communities, local powers, or mixed populations shaped by trade and migration. The coastline that once served the palace world becomes a place of experiment, where old imperial oversight weakens and new identities form in the gaps. Cyprus also changes profoundly. The island does not simply fall into darkness. In some places, destruction and abandonment occur. In others, new settlements and cultural forms emerge. Aegean influences become more visible in pottery, architecture, and material life, but Cyprus remains its own complex crossroads rather than a passive refuge. People arriving from the Aegean, Anatolia, or the Levant may have joined existing Cypriot communities, bringing skills, styles, and memories The island's copper resources still matter, though the old bronze-centered trade system is changing. In this reshaped world, Cyprus becomes both survivor and transformer, carrying late Bronze Age traditions into new Iron Age patterns. In Anatolia, the aftermath is equally uneven. The Hittite imperial centre is gone, but people do not vanish with the empire. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, Neo-Hittite and Luwian-speaking states preserve elements of Hittite culture, writing, royal imagery, and political tradition. Farther west, the old landscape of late Bronze Age kingdoms gives way to smaller, less clearly documented communities. Some regions may have received migrants, others may have sent them. The connection between Anatolian upheaval and the Sea Peoples remains one of the most debated parts of the story, especially because several named groups have possible links to western or southern Anatolia. What survives in the record suggests a region not simply conquered from outside, but fragmented from within and reshaped through movement in many directions. The Aegean, too, is transformed. The Mycenaean palaces are gone, and with them the bureaucratic world of Linear B tablets, palace storerooms, and centralized redistribution. But the people of Greece do not disappear. They live in smaller communities, sometimes in old sites, sometimes in new ones. They keep memories, crafts, and fragments of older traditions, but life becomes more local and less monumentally organized. Some Aegean people may have migrated eastward, joining the movements that Egyptian records compress under Sea Peoples' names. Others remain and adapt to a poorer, less connected world. The collapse turns the Aegean from a palace network into a landscape of survival, memory, and slow reinvention. Across all these regions, the aftermath shows the same pattern: destruction followed by mixing, contraction followed by adaptation. The Sea Peoples are easiest to see when they are enemies in Egyptian art, but their deeper legacy lies in settlement. They help mark the movement from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, not because they alone cause that transition, but because their movements are part of the wider rearrangement. Coastal Canaan becomes home to new Philistine cities. Cyprus becomes a crossroads of transformed traditions. Anatolia breaks into successor states and local powers. The Aegean loses palatial writing but preserves human continuity beneath political ruin. This is why the question of where the survivors settled is so important. It changes the story from invasion to transformation. The people who crossed the sea were not only the last shock of a dying world, some became the first communities of the world that followed. Their names may fade, their languages may change, and their origins may remain debated, but their presence can still be felt in the altered map of the early Iron Age. The old palaces wanted to classify them as enemies. Time made them settlers, neighbours, rivals, ancestors, and finally part of the land itself. When the fires cool and the last palace doors hang broken, the silence that follows is not empty. It is filled with people. They are still there in the valleys, on the coasts, among the ruins, beside fields that must be planted whether kings have fallen or not. Children are born into houses built from reused stones. Farmers return to terraces if the land can still feed them. Potters shape clay in styles that remember old worlds and answer new needs. Shepherds move animals through landscapes where palace tax collectors no longer arrive with the same authority. The age becomes darker to historians not because everyone disappears, but because the old systems that produced records disappear. The lamps of administration go out, and ordinary life continues beyond their light. This is why the phrase Dark Age must be handled carefully. It does not mean that people become less intelligent, less human, or suddenly primitive. It means that, in many regions, writing becomes rare or vanishes from the surviving record. Monumental architecture declines. long-distance trade contracts, and centralized palace economies break apart. The darkness belongs partly to us, because we can no longer see as clearly. In Mycenaean Greece, the loss is dramatic. Linear B, the script used to record palace administration, disappears after the fall of the palace centres. For several centuries, the Greek world leaves far fewer written records. When writing returns, it comes in a different form, using an alphabet adapted from the Phoenicians. Between those two worlds lies a long interval where memory must travel without palace tablets. The disappearance of Linear B reveals something striking about Bronze Age writing. It was not used everywhere for everything. It served the palace. It counted goods, workers, offerings, animals, weapons, and stores. When the institution that needed those records collapsed, the script had little support outside it. A village farmer did not necessarily need Linear B to live. A potter did not need it to fire vessels. A household did not need it to remember ancestors. Writing can look like a universal sign of civilization from a distance, but in this world it is often a tool of administration. Remove the palace, and the tool is set down for generations. Trade also shrinks, though it does not vanish completely. The great international circuits of the late Bronze Age no longer operate with the same scale and confidence. Copper still matters, but bronze loses some of its centrality as iron gradually becomes more common. Luxury goods move less predictably. Imported pottery becomes rarer in some areas. Palatial storerooms no longer gather and redistribute wealth across wide territories. A community that once received materials through royal networks may now depend more on local production, local exchange, and smaller-scale contacts. The world becomes narrower for many people, not because the sea has vanished, but because the trust and institutions that made the sea reliable have weakened. The contraction can be seen in settlement patterns. Some large centres decline or are abandoned. Smaller villages become more important. Populations move from exposed lowland sites to more defensible places in some regions. In other areas, people cluster near resources, water, or safer routes. The pattern varies, and scholars still debate local causes because the so-called Dark Age is not one uniform condition spread evenly across the Mediterranean. Some communities suffer deeply. Others adapt quickly. Some coastal towns regain importance through new trade. Some inland regions become less visible simply because they leave fewer durable traces. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad change is unmistakable. The palace is no longer the main organizing force of life in many places. For ordinary people, this change may have carried both loss and relief. Palace systems could provide security, food redistribution, employment, religious festivals, and access to goods from far away. They could also demand labour, seize surplus, conscript men, and bind communities to elite priorities. When palaces fell, some people lost protection and access to wider markets. Others may have escaped heavy obligations. A shepherd beyond the reach of a former tax official might not mourn the end of palace bureaucracy. A bronze smith without imported tin might mourn it intensely. A dependent worker once fed by palace rations might face hunger. Collapse is rarely experienced the same way by everyone. A lesser-known detail is that some skills survive even when states fail. Pottery continues, weaving continues, farming continues, metalworking changes rather than disappears. Oral traditions may preserve fragments of memory long after written archives burn. In the Aegean, later Greek epic traditions seem to remember a world of bronze-armed heroes, great citadels, and overseas wars, though these memories are reshaped by centuries of storytelling and cannot be read as direct history. Still, they suggest that the Palace Age did not vanish from human imagination. It became legend, simplified, magnified, and transformed by people who lived among the ruins. The end of the Old Order also changes warfare. without great palace systems supporting chariot forces, elite equipment, and centralized command. Military organization becomes more local and varied. Iron weapons do not instantly replace bronze everywhere, and early iron is not automatically superior. But iron has one important advantage over time. Its ores are more widely available than the tin needed for bronze. As iron working improves, communities less tied to old bronze trade networks can arm themselves differently. This technological shift is gradual, uneven, and often overstated, but it belongs to the larger movement away from the late Bronze Age world of specialized long-distance dependency. In the Levant, the smaller and more fragmented political landscape allows new identities to form. Philistine cities develop along the coast, Israelite communities emerge in the highlands, though their origins and development remain debated. Phoenician city-states preserve and expand maritime traditions from the northern Levant, eventually becoming some of the great sailors and traders of the Iron Age. Aramean groups rise in Syria. Neo-Hittite kingdoms carry older Anatolian and Syrian traditions into new forms. The collapse creates hardship, but it also opens space, where giant powers once pressed down. Smaller kingdoms and peoples begin to write their own histories. This is the paradox of the Dark Age. It is an ending that becomes a beginning, but only after generations of reduced scale, lost records, and local adaptation. To those who lived through the first decades after collapse, the future probably did not feel like renewal. It may have felt like absence, no great king to appeal to, no reliable shipments, no palace rations, no scribal order, no certainty that the next valley was safe. Yet from that absence, new patterns slowly formed. People learned which routes still worked, which crops could survive, which neighbours could be trusted, which ruins could be quarried for stone, which memories were worth keeping. The sea peoples belong to this darkness not only as destroyers, but as part of the human reshuffling that follows. Some settle in the very regions where palace authority has thinned. Some merge with local populations. Some disappear under new names. They are absorbed into the smaller, poorer, more improvisational world that replaces the palace age. Their arrival is one reason the map changes, but the map also changes them. After the collapse, no one remains exactly what they were before. Not Egypt, not the Aegean, not Cyprus, not Canaan, not the descendants of those who crossed the sea. So the Dark Age begins not with total silence, but with a different kind of sound, fewer scribes, fewer royal messengers, fewer great cargoes, fewer monumental claims of eternal power. In their place are footsteps through abandoned courtyards, hammers lifting stones from ruined walls, cooking fires in smaller houses, boats making shorter voyages, and stories told at night about a time when the palaces were full and the sea brought wonders before it brought fear. Out of the smaller, poorer, more local world that follows the collapse, something new begins to take shape. It does not happen quickly, and it does not feel like triumph to the generations living closest to the ruin. For them, the first task is survival, planting fields, repairing houses, finding safe harbours, learning which roads can still be travelled and which names still carry power. But history has a way of turning broken systems into open space. When the great Bronze Age palaces lose their grip, the Eastern Mediterranean is no longer organised around the same few royal courts, the same diplomatic language, the same dependence on copper and tin, the same old hierarchy of great kings and vassals. The world rebuilds, but it rebuilds differently. One of the most important changes is political scale. The late Bronze Age had been dominated by large states and palace networks that concentrated wealth, writing, military power, and long-distance exchange. After the collapse, many regions are governed by smaller kingdoms, city-states, tribal coalitions, local chiefs, and regional powers whose authority is more flexible and often more fragile. This can look like decline, and in many ways it is. Monumental architecture becomes less common in some places. Elite goods become less abundant. The old international style fades. Yet smaller scale also allows new identities to develop, communities that were once overshadowed by Egypt. Hatti or Mycenaean palaces begin to occupy the historical foreground. In the Levant, this transformation is especially visible. Along the coast, Phoenician cities such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and others inherit much from the older Canaanite world, but they rise into a new kind of prominence during the Iron Age. They do not build vast inland empires at first. Their strength lies in ships, ports, skilled craft production, and commercial reach. As larger imperial systems weaken, maritime city-states can move through the gaps. They trade timber, purple dye, metalwork, glass, luxury goods, and ideas. They become famous sailors not because the sea has become safe again in some simple way, but because they master the risks of a transformed Mediterranean. The Phoenicians also help carry one of the most consequential inventions of the post-collapse world, alphabetic writing. Alphabetic systems had earlier roots in the 2nd millennium BC, developing in the Levant from experiments that simplified writing into signs representing sounds. But in the Iron Age, the Phoenician alphabet becomes a powerful tool of trade, administration, and cultural transmission. It is easier to learn than complex cuneiform or hieroglyphic systems, and it travels well with merchants. The Greeks later adapt a version of it, adding letters for vowels, and from that adaptation eventually come many later alphabets. This is one of the quiet revolutions that follows the fall of palaces. When the old scribal systems fade in some regions, a more portable form of writing begins to spread. The change in writing reveals a deeper shift. Bronze Age literacy had often been tied to palaces, temples, and trained scribal elites. Iron Age alphabetic writing can still serve elites, but it has the potential to move through wider social channels, traders, smaller courts, craftsmen, and local administrators. It is not democratic in any modern sense, but it is less dependent on the great palace machine. A merchant's mark, a short inscription, a royal notice, a dedication. A name scratched on pottery, these become part of a more flexible written world. The collapse destroys archives, but it also clears space for scripts that are lighter, simpler, and better suited to a fragmented age. Warfare changes as well. The chariot, symbol of late Bronze Age aristocratic battle, does not vanish overnight, but its centrality declines in many regions. Infantry becomes increasingly important. Iron weapons spread gradually, though early iron is not always better than good bronze. The significance of iron lies not in instant superiority, but in availability. Tin, needed for bronze, depends on long-distance exchange from limited sources. Iron ore is much more widespread. As techniques improve, societies less connected to old bronze trade routes can equip warriors without relying on the same fragile networks. No single technological change fully accounts for the New Age, but iron belongs to the broader movement away from palace-controlled dependency. In the highlands of Canaan, new communities emerge that will later be associated with ancient Israel. Their origins remain debated, and the evidence suggests a complex process involving local Canaanite populations, social change, settlement expansion, and perhaps movement from different groups rather than one sudden outside arrival. In the same broad landscape, Philistine cities develop on the coastal plain, carrying mixed traditions shaped by Aegean connections and Levantine realities. Aramaean kingdoms grow in Syria. Neo-Hittite states preserve and transform older Anatolian and northern Syrian traditions. Egypt remains powerful in memory and sometimes in action, but it no longer dominates the region as it did during the height of the New Kingdom. The map fills with many voices. A lesser-known aspect of this rebuilding is how much continuity hides beneath change. Collapse did not wipe the slate clean. Farmers still knew their fields. Local gods remained meaningful, though they might be worshipped under changing political conditions. Craft traditions continued, adapted, or merged. Old roads did not disappear from the ground. Ruins became landmarks, quarries, shelters, and sources of memory. Some families may have lived through the end of one political order and the beginning of another without moving far at all. From the view of kings, the world had fallen. From the view of a village, the world had become harsher, perhaps freer in some ways, but still made of seasons, work, kinship, and survival. The sea peoples, or the groups gathered under that modern label, are part of this rebuilding precisely because many of them cease to be outsiders. The Peliset become linked with Philistine culture in the southern Levant. Other groups may settle, merge, or disappear into populations whose later names no longer reveal the movement that created them. Their ships and weapons matter less over time than their children, their houses, their pottery, their marriages, and their adoption of a local customs. The people who once appear in Egyptian reliefs as enemies become part of the Iron Age human landscape. This is how many invasions end in the ancient world, not with eternal separation, but with absorption and transformation. The world rebuilt differently because it had learned, in the harshest possible way, that dependence on a few great centres could be fatal. The new Mediterranean is still connected, but its connections are organised through different hands. Phoenician sailors expand westward. Greek communities eventually recover and begin founding settlements across the sea. Inland kingdoms rise and fall. Empires will return, but they will be different kinds of empires, built in a world where iron, alphabetic writing, smaller polities, and mobile traders have changed the rules. The Bronze Age palace world does not come back. Its ruins remain, but the future grows around them. There is no clean line where collapse ends and recovery begins. For a long time, they coexist. A ruined palace wall may stand above a village that has already adapted. A port once terrified by strange sails may send out its own merchants again. A people once named as invaders may become known by a city, a language, or a god. The sea, which carried fear in the age of destruction, begins once more to carry possibility. But it is not the same sea in human memory. It has shown what connection can build and what connection can break. The world after the Sea Peoples is not a restored Bronze Age. It is something leaner, more scattered, more experimental, and in the long reach of history, astonishingly fertile. The mystery of the Sea Peoples endures because it sits in the broken place between too much evidence and not enough. There are names, but not full identities. There are battles, but not every cause. There are burned cities, but not always the hand that burned them. There are migrations, but not complete routes. There are Egyptian victories carved with confidence, but no surviving Sea Peoples archive to answer back. The old palace world leaves behind just enough to show that something enormous happened, and too little to make that enormous thing simple. Every generation of scholars returns to the same scattered clues and finds the same warning waiting inside them. Collapse is rarely one story. For a long time, it was tempting to imagine the Sea Peoples as the great destroyers of the Bronze Age, a violent confederation sweeping out of the unknown and smashing empires that would otherwise have endured. The image is dramatic, and it has the appeal of clarity. Empires fell because invaders came. Cities burned because warriors attacked. The old world ended because enemies from the sea broke it. There is truth inside that picture, but not enough truth. Egyptian records do describe dangerous foreign groups. Some cities were surely attacked. Maritime violence and armed migration were real. Yet the evidence remains incomplete. and the wider pattern refuses to obey a single cause explanation. The great strength of the Sea People's story is also its trap. They appear exactly where historians want an answer at the moment of collapse. Their names are vivid, their images are memorable, their ships and headdresses give shape to an otherwise tangled crisis. They become the face of the disaster because faces are easier to remember than systems. But systems are what failed. Trade networks faltered, palace economies strained, drought may have reduced harvests. Earthquakes may have damaged key centres, mercenary groups slipped beyond control, local rebellions may have weakened authority from within. The movement of desperate people increased pressure on borders and ports. The Sea Peoples were part of this, perhaps an important part, but they were not the whole storm. What survives in the record suggests that the late Bronze Age world collapsed through convergence. That word lacks drama, but it carries the weight of the evidence. Convergence means that different pressures arrived close enough together to overwhelm systems that might have survived them separately. A palace can survive a bad harvest if trade routes are open. It can survive a raid if granaries are full and walls are intact. It can survive an earthquake if labour and supplies remain available. It can survive political unrest if armies are loyal and enemies are distant. But when food is short, trade is unsafe, walls are damaged, soldiers are unpaid, refugees are moving, and rival powers cannot help. The palace becomes fragile in every direction at once. The Sea Peoples make sense inside that convergence. They are not a neat ethnic bloc. They are better understood as named groups within a wider movement of fighters, sailors, migrants, displaced families, and opportunistic leaders. Some may have roots in the Aegean, some in Anatolia, some in Cyprus, the Levant, or farther west. Some identities may have formed during migration rather than before it. A group can become a people on the road, welded together by danger, leadership, and shared need. Scholars still debate the origins of each name, and many debates remain unresolved because the surviving evidence was never designed to answer modern questions. Egyptian scribes wanted to glorify Pharaoh, not preserve the inner histories of defeated foreigners. That silence is perhaps the most haunting part of the mystery. We do not hear a Peliset mother explain why her family left. We do not hear a Shurden warrior describe whether he fights for pay, hunger, loyalty, or survival. We do not hear a Chika sailor remember the port he lost. We do not hear a Mycenaean palace worker describe the day the ration system failed, or a Hittite official realizing that messages from the coast no longer bring reassurance. The record is full of rulers, gods, enemies, and inventories. It is far thinner when it comes to fear at the household level. Yet the collapse was lived there first. The Sea Peoples also remind us that identity in the ancient world is often fluid under pressure. A man described as an invader in one inscription might have served as a mercenary in another decade. A community remembered as foreign might become local within a few generations. A group that arrives violently may leave descendants who farm, trade, and worship alongside those they once threatened. The later Philistine cities show this process clearly. Possible Aegean-connected newcomers become part of the Levantine world, creating a hybrid culture that cannot be reduced to either origin or destination. The destroyer becomes settler, the stranger becomes neighbour, the enemy becomes one thread in a new society. This is why the idea that the Sea Peoples destroyed empires is both powerful and incomplete. They helped destroy some things. They exploited weakness. They carried violence into vulnerable places. They may have delivered final blows to cities already trembling, but they also reveal the weakness of the word destroy. The Hittite Empire fell, but Hittite-related traditions continued in successor states. Mycenaean palaces vanished, but Greek-speaking communities endured. Ugarit was destroyed. But Levantine maritime culture did not die. In time, Phoenician sailors carried it farther than before. Egypt survived, though diminished. The Bronze Age ended, but people did not. Civilization did not disappear. It changed shape. The unfinished mystery, then, is not only where the Sea Peoples came from, it is what they tell us about the fragility of complexity. The late Bronze Age world was sophisticated, international, and deeply connected. Its elites exchanged gifts, languages, metals, brides, and diplomatic courtesies across great distances. Its ships stitched continents together. Its scribes made power visible in clay. Yet that same connectedness meant that failure could travel. A famine in one region, a lost fleet in another, a broken alliance elsewhere, and a raid along a coast could become parts of one widening crisis. The system was impressive, but it was not invulnerable. In the end, the Sea Peoples remain at the edge of vision, standing on the decks of strange ships, walking beside ox carts, serving in foreign armies, settling in new lands, and disappearing into names that later history barely recognizes. They are not a single answer to the fall of the Bronze Age. They are a sign that the answer is larger than any one people. They are the human face of collapse, armed, hungry, mobile, dangerous, adaptable, and searching for a future in a world where old futures had burned. Long after the palaces fall silent, the sea remains. It moves against the same coasts with the same patient rhythm, touching the stones of ruined harbours, the buried edges of old quays, the places where watchmen once searched the horizon and tried to decide whether a sail meant trade, hunger, or war. The waves do not remember names as people do. They do not separate Sheridan from Peliset, merchant from raider, refugee from soldier, king from captive. They carry salt over all of it, smoothing the sharp edges of catastrophe until only traces remain for later hands to uncover. The world of the Sea Peoples is distant now, but not unreachable. It survives in broken walls, in changed pottery, in tablets hardened by fire, in carved enemies on Egyptian stone, and in the long silence after writing disappears from places that once counted everything. It survives in the uncomfortable knowledge that civilizations can look strongest just before their dependencies are exposed. Bronze kings believed in walls, treaties, ships, gods, grain, and the authority of the palace. Many of those things were real. Many worked for centuries, yet no system, however splendid, stands outside weather, hunger, fear, ambition, and chance. What makes this ancient collapse linger in memory is not only the destruction, it is the survival. People walked away from burned cities carrying tools, children, stories, and habits of life. They settled in unfamiliar lands. They rebuilt smaller houses beside larger ruins. They changed names, learned new languages, borrowed gods, kept recipes, adapted weapons, forgot some things and guarded others. The Bronze Age ended, but the human story did not pause. It narrowed, scattered, and darkened for a time, then slowly widened again. Perhaps that is the final image the Sea Peoples leave behind, not a single fleet appearing from nowhere, not one enemy destroying the world, but thousands of human beings moving through uncertainty. Some are violent, some are desperate, some are opportunists, some are frightened. Some are children who do not know that historians will one day argue over the names carved by their enemies. They move because staying has become impossible, and in moving, they help end one world and begin another. And so the ancient sea keeps breathing against the shore. Beneath its wind and foam lie the roots of lost ships, the memory of vanished kingdoms, and the faint outline of a warning written not in one language, but in ruins. Even the greatest ages are temporary, and even after fire, life continues in the ashes.